But you also just have now a hyper-individualism emerging, right? The whole idea of monogamy is starting to be threatened. Where do you see that coming from? And yeah, kind of catch me up to where we're at today.
Sure. Yeah. So I blame France. No, I'm kidding.
Yes.
No, I do start my chapter on the assault on marriage with Rousseau,
Okay. Yeah.
who my French friends will point out is not French. He's actually Swiss.
Okay.
So he was born he was a Calvinist from Geneva. He was not a Catholic Frenchman. But Rousseau was really one of the first philosophers to kind of reject custom and habit as forces for good, and talk about how there was this state of nature, and that man was more peaceful and getting and at heart in the state of nature, and then that society's customs were corrupting him.
Hmm.
And then from there, I turn to next to Mill, the libertarian. And so, he also saw, customs as harmful to individual fulfillment.
Hmm.
And so he advocated for experiments in living, and that he
Hmm.
thought these experiments in living, which challenged custom, were essential to human flourishing. And so that's, I think, where you really start getting into this more of an individual focus, and this pushing away from the idea that the society and the family responsibilities that we have, are fundamental.
Okay.
And of course, Mill also then gives us the harm principle, saying that, as long as, it doesn't hurt someone, then it's fine. But it's not fine, because what goes on behind closed doors doesn't stay there. Okay. So then I go through a number of anthropologists like Margaret Mead, and how, she was beginning to cultural relativism, and that all cultures are equal, no culture is better than the other. And so she has this book on sexuality in American Samoa, and how free it is, and how healthy all the young girls are who are sleeping with everyone they want. And this becomes a New York Times bestseller.
Hmm.
And she comes with this great columnist, everything else. But she was wrong. Basically, her portrayal of American Samoa was just false. This was it was a polygamous culture. It was part of the polygamous world order, and then you had Christian missionaries come in, and they were the young girls. They were just as committed to this monogamous, new norms as anyone else. But there was a need within the intellectual elite to say, oh, monogamy is just one of many options. And Margaret Mead kind of fed that.
Mm.
And so that was then, kind of reinforced again by moving to Indiana, Kinsley. Okay, so Kinsley was actually a biology professor studying wasps, when Indiana University wanted to start having a class on sexuality. And so he volunteered for that. And then from that, he got a four-grant foundation, and then that became where he funded his research into sexuality. And so, of course, he publishes his book, which talks about how common infidelity is, how common gay sex is, and all the other things, which, just like Mead, turns out to be completely false. Even worse, now that we have his biographies and everything else, he was clearly an ideological actor. Like, he encouraged his staff to cheat on each other's spouses and sleep with each other, and he even filmed sex acts in his house. Like, this was not like a unbiased scientist. But his work is you end up seeing it in model penal codes. You end up seeing it in Supreme Court dissents. Again, you have the intellectual elite that is so hungry to be sexually liberated from monogamous norms that they treat it as science, when we have since found out everything he said was wrong. So from there, you then have kind of the feminist revolution, and I talk about Simone de Beauvoir, who wrote The Second Sex. This is a woman who was not married to Sartre, right? Because she was anti-marriage, as was Sartre, but they were lovers. But she was also she was a professor, and so she would actually seduce her students virgins and feed them to Sartre, who would then deflower them. So, but she wrote the one of the foundational texts of feminism, which was The Second Sex, which inspired Betty Friedan and everything after that. So you have these ideas seeping into the intellectual elite, and then you have a series of, I identify 3 Supreme Court cases that really kind of overturn the foundation of American family law, and then usher in the decline of marriage.
Hmm.
And so the first one is called King v. Smith. It's 1968. So this is a case out of Alabama where the Supreme Court rules that man of the house rules are hereby illegal. So man in the house rules were rules intended to make sure that only deserving women were able to receive welfare. Okay. So what it meant is that before the case, welfare workers would come in and say, look, if you are, truly a woman in need, you can have this money. But if you're living with a man, you should be, married to that man, and therefore you become ineligible for this program. And so if you were cohabitating with a man, you would not be able to. The Supreme Court gets rid of that. And so after that, basically the status quo becomes that if you're a woman and you want to be on welfare, you can cohabitate with a man. Okay. But then if you get married, then you no longer are eligible for the programs. So this creates marriage penalties in welfare programs.
Hmm.
And then since then, of course, you have the huge expansion of the welfare state, and those marriage penalties then go in there. So think of any means-tested program, Section 8 housing, food stamps, Medicaid, Affordable Care Act subsidies. All these programs have marriage penalties, and that's all because of this 1968 decision.
So before that, you're saying it was a reverse. There was a advantage to getting married, and then that was inverted in this case.
Before you were just not eligible for programs, if you were having a relationship. But of course, people have needs for relationship, and so before it was kind of pushing people to get married to have a provider. Whereas after this was saying it doesn't matter, you can have a man in the house, you can meet those sexual needs, but as soon as you get married to a person, then you lose all those benefits.
Okay.
So that was the marriage penalty that was created. So the second big case comes in 1973, and it's Eisenstadt v. Baird. So up until Eisenstadt v. Baird, states could regulate birth control, and they could say married couples are allowed to have birth control, allowed to buy birth control, but single people are not. Okay. And the court comes along and say, no, the right to contraception is an individual right. Marriage doesn't matter anymore. So before that, there was a whole string of cases where the Supreme Court had said that the foundation of civil society is the married family. And that is true up until Eisenstadt v. Baird, where the court says, never mind, marriage doesn't matter. This is an individual right. Everyone is entitled to birth control. Go ahead.
So before, you're saying that was the states. Some of the states actually, do you know how widespread that was before the Supreme Court case? Was there a lot of states that made contraception only available to married couples?
No, I don't have the exact numbers, but I mean, the state was out of Massachusetts. I mean, the case was out of Massachusetts.
Okay. Yeah. Wow. Yeah, that's surprising. Okay.
So, and then the third case is Miller versus California. And so this is also 1973. And so this is a case which significantly weakened the federal government's ability to prosecute pornography cases. So before that, you had this standard where something was obscene, it could be considered pornography. But then after Miller versus California, they added this extra artistic or literary value test. And if a pornographer could show that their obscene material had some type of political or literary or artistic statement value to it, then it was no longer obscene, and you could produce it. And so after that, then you get the huge Behind the Green Door, all those 70s porn movies. And then you have the VHS and just the explosion of porn after that, to the point that today, we have infinite amounts of the hardest core pornography available 24/7 at our fingertips. And that's all traceable back to the 1973 Miller versus California case. Wow. So from this first census up until 1960, close to 80% of American households were headed by a married couple. Okay. And up until 1960, young Black men and women were actually more likely to be married than young white men and women. But after that King versus Smith decision in 1968, the bottom falls out of it for African Americans, to the point where by 1980, only 20% of young African American women are married. And then, of course, over the preceding decades, you have white and Hispanic households keep creeping up to the new standard, to the point that today only 45% of American households are headed by a married couple.
Man, wow. So, Con, would you say your case is that their like culture is sort of downstream of these sort of incentives or various laws? Like there's a kind of draw the line there for me because obviously some people will, you know, suggest there, oh, there's a lot of factors involved in how culture is created. But how influential do you see the way that the government is changing incentives or passing new laws to the way that the culture thinks about these things?
No, I mean, I do think that culture is, downstream of politics a lot of times. I think you can go back and say, look, I mean, there was clearly something culturally going on among liberal elites in the late 60s and early 70s that caused them to devalue marriage, right? But then once they start putting that devalue of marriage into actual policy, so that uh, the married couple is no longer a protected status, then that changes people's behavior.
Hmm.
And then once that behavior is changed, once it is no longer a norm that when people become of a sexually active age, they really should be getting married to protect the offspring and make sure that they are able to provide for themselves and each other. And once it's understood that it's the government's job to, step in and do that instead of the institution of marriage, then yeah, that changes how people behave. That changes the culture.